Most organizations still ask the wrong question about Power Platform. Is this thing secure enough for enterprise audit-heavy use? They assume the risk lies in Microsoft's stack. It doesn't. Here's the blunt answer. Yes, the Power Platform security architecture is enterprise grade. The weak link is almost never Microsoft's security. The weak link is your governance. This isn't theoretical. These failures are already showing up in audits, incidents, and post-mortems. If you're responsible for enterprise risk, compliance, or platform strategy, this conversation is for you. So in this episode, you'll see why Power Platform is secure, how governance disappears in real tenants, and what a defendable operating model actually looks like. Why this question exists. Enterprise anxiety around low-code. Most enterprises didn't wake up one day and decide to run critical processes on a low-code platform. They arrived here through a very specific path. Years of backlogs, shadow spreadsheets, access databases under someone's desk, and temporary macros that turned into business-critical systems. Power Platform just made that visible, fast, and tenant-wide. Now add the scale. Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, Copilot Studio, all sitting in the same Microsoft 365 tenant as your email, your SharePoint, your Teams, your Entra ID. You're not experimenting with a toy platform off to the side. You're plugging a low-code engine straight into the center of your digital estate. That's where the anxiety comes from. On one side, you have the marketing story, anyone can build. And to be fair, that's mostly true. With Dataverse, connectors, and Copilot, the friction to build something real is lower than it has ever been. On the other side, you have the audit story. Who owns this? Where does the data go? What happens if the person who built it leaves? Those are not Power Platform questions. Those are governance questions. But because the platform is visible, it becomes the scapegoat. Low-code feels out of control for three architectural reasons. First, speed. Traditional development forces you through demand management, design reviews, change boards. Power Platform collapses that. A motivated analyst can go from idea to production adjacent in days. Your governance model probably still assumes months. Second, invisible change. Most enterprises have monitoring for servers, networks, maybe some APIs. They rarely have real monitoring for, we just added 3 more approval paths to this flow that touches payroll. Low-code change happens at the edges of your existing observability. Third, citizen development without citizen development governance. You empowered business users to build, but you didn't give them an operating model. No environment strategy, no DLP baseline, no RACI for app ownership, no lifecycle rules. You gave them a Ferrari and left the keys in. So the CIO sees adoption spikes in the admin center. The CISO sees connectors that can technically move data to Gmail and Dropbox. Compliance sees Power BI reports over HR and finance data built by people they've never met. Everyone asks the same question. Is Power Platform secure enough for us? From their perspective, it feels reasonable. Breach headlines involve cloud services all the time. The platform is visible, the controls are not. Architecturally, though, that question is misdirected. Power Platform sits on Azure. Identity is Entra ID. Data can live in Dataverse, in SQL, in SharePoint, in Fabric. The security primitives, authentication, authorization, encryption, conditional access, customer managed keys, DLP, auditing already exist. The platform team at Microsoft has a full-time job making sure those primitives meet enterprise and regulatory standards. Your job is completely different. Your job is to decide who can build, where they can build, what data they're allowed to touch, how those changes move through dev, test, prod, and how you'll notice when reality drifts away from your intent. That's governance, and that governance expresses itself through one thing, the control plane. The control plane is everything that turns "we want this to be safe" into actual configuration. Environments, DLP policies, security roles, conditional access rules, environment routing, managed environments, COE automation. When that control plane is coherent, Power Platform behaves predictably. When it's not, you're running a distributed decision engine with no clear design. This is the uncomfortable truth. The platform is already operating at enterprise scale, whether you acknowledge it or not. You might still think of Power Apps as that thing the HR team uses for a form. In reality, it's a multi-tenant, low-code surface attached to your core identity provider. So when you ask, is Power Platform secure enough? You're really asking, can we govern enterprise low-code and AI at the speed our users are already moving? And right now, for most organizations, the honest answer is not with the governance model you inherited from classic IT. That's why we need to separate 3 concepts very clearly. Security, what Microsoft secures. Governance, how you decide the platform should be used. Control plane, where those decisions either become enforceable policy or slowly decay into chaos. To judge risk properly, you have to stop blurring those 3 together. Once you see that split, you can ask a better question. What does Microsoft actually secure for you, and where does your governance start to fail in real tenants? Security versus governance versus control plane, the foundational misunderstanding. Most organizations collapse 3 very different ideas into one vague feeling of comfort. They say Microsoft is secure, so we're fine, or I don't trust this platform, lock it down. Both positions are based on the same misunderstanding. They treat security, governance, and the control plane as if they're the same thing. They're not. Let's define them in architectural terms. Security, in this context, is what Microsoft implements and operates. Power Platform is a SaaS layer on Azure and Entra ID. That stack gives you identity, authentication, authorization primitives, encryption at rest and in transit, regional isolation, customer-managed keys, logging, and compliance certifications. That's security. Governance is what you decide to do with that capability surface. It's your intent, expressed as policy, who can build, which data sources are allowed, what constitutes production, what risk levels are acceptable per business unit, how you treat citizen development, how long solutions are supported. Governance is your operating model and your rules of engagement. The control plane is everything that turns those rules into actual behavior. Environments, security groups, dataverse roles, DLP policies, connector classifications, tenant isolation, conditional access, environment routing, managed environments, QoE automation, audit and monitoring, all of that is control plane. It's the distributed configuration layer that tells the platform how to behave for your tenant. Security is Microsoft's job. Governance is your job. The control plane is where those jobs meet or fail to meet. When people say Power Platform is secure, they're usually pointing at the first layer. When they say Power Platform is dangerous, they're usually reacting to the second and third layers being absent, inconsistent, or opaque. Conflating secure platform with well-governed usage produces two predictable failure modes. The first is blind trust. You see the compliance badges, the Azure branding, the Entra ID integration. You assume that because the underlying security model is robust, whatever your users build on top must inherit that robustness. You let the default environment run as a free-for-all. You never define a data loss prevention strategy. You never classify environments by data sensitivity. You never ask who owns what. You think you're safe because Microsoft is secure. You're not. You've just outsourced your assumptions to a control plane you never designed. The second failure mode is over lockdown. You're nervous about low code. You treat every citizen developer as a potential insider threat. So you ban most connectors, you block environment creation, you push all development into a single IT-owned environment, and you insist that every app go through the same heavyweight process as a custom net system. You think you're reducing risk. In reality, you're generating shadow IT. The business still needs automation, so it goes back to spreadsheets, access, unsanctioned SaaS, and personal cloud storage. You've moved risk off the Power Platform surface and into places that are much harder to see. In both cases, the underlying security posture of the platform hasn't changed. What changed is how your governance intent, or the lack of it, was expressed in the control plane. Architecturally, Power Platform is not an app builder. It is a distributed decision engine that makes real-time authorization and data movement decisions based on the configuration of that control plane. Every DLP rule, every environment, every dataverse role, every conditional access policy is effectively a line of code in an invisible authorization compiler. When you add just one exception for a VIP, you're not making a small change. You're introducing a new branch into that compiler. When you copy an environment for quick testing and don't fix the roles, you're duplicating an authorization graph you already don't fully understand. When you let environment creation run open, you're allowing anyone to add new decision surfaces you don't monitor. Over time, those exceptions, copies, and ad hoc decisions accumulate. That's architectural erosion. That's how you move from a deterministic security model, where you can confidently predict behavior, to a probabilistic one, where you're hoping nothing surprising happens. This is the foundational misunderstanding. Power Platform security and Power Platform governance are not the same thing, and neither of them is the same as the control plane. Security answers, can this platform be operated safely at enterprise scale? Governance answers, how do we want to use it? The control plane answers, what actually happens when someone in our tenant clicks run? So if you remember nothing else so far, Microsoft secures the platform. Governance secures your usage. And the control plane is where your intent either becomes policy or becomes chaos. Once you see that clearly, the next logical question isn't, is Power Platform secure? It's, what does Microsoft actually secure for us? And where does our governance start to disappear in real tenants? What Microsoft actually secures: identity, data, compliance. So let's answer the fair question. What does Microsoft actually secure for you in Power Platform? Start with identity and access. Every sign-in to Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, Copilot Studio, all of that runs through Microsoft Entra ID. That means a single identity plane for humans and non-human identities. Users, service principals, managed identities, even AI agents as those mature. The platform itself doesn't invent a new identity store. It consumes your existing one. So when you turn on multi-factor authentication, when you enforce conditional access policies for risky locations or unmanaged devices, when you require compliant machines for admins, those controls apply to the Power Platform surface as well. You're operating a single unified front door. On top of that, environment access is mediated through security groups and roles. A user can't just appear in a restricted environment. They have to be granted a role in that environment or be in a group you chose. Dataverse then adds another layer: table level, row level, and field level security via security roles, and if you choose, hierarchy security. Architecturally, identity is not the weak point, as long as you've treated Entra ID as an enterprise control plane and not as a glorified address book. Now the data plane. Dataverse, the relational data platform behind model-driven apps and many serious Canvas apps, runs as a managed service on Azure. Data is encrypted at rest and in transit. You can bring customer-managed keys in managed environments if your regulatory model demands it. There's regional isolation. Your Europe data doesn't quietly drift to the US because someone felt like it. Environment boundaries are real. A Dataverse environment is a security and data boundary. Records don't casually flow between environments unless you build something to do that. Backup and restore capabilities exist. There's auditing at the table and field level if you enable it. The data platform side of Power Platform behaves like an enterprise service because that's exactly what it is. Even when you're not using Dataverse, maybe you're building over SQL, SharePoint, Fabric, or external systems, Power Platform doesn't bypass those security models. It connects with your identity, respects the underlying permissions, and relies on the connectors and DLP policies to control data movement. That brings us to guardrails, data loss prevention. From the admin center, you classify connectors into groups: business, non-business, and blocked. In the newer model, allowed and blocked. Those policies can be tenant-wide or scoped to specific environments. The rules are simple but powerful. Business connectors can't be combined with non-business ones in the same app or flow, and blocked connectors can't be used at all. For example, you can allow SharePoint, Dataverse, and Exchange in a finance prod policy and block things like Twitter, Dropbox, and personal OneDrive. You can use tenant isolation to say flows in this tenant cannot send data to tenants we don't trust. You can apply more permissive policies in dev and far stricter ones in prod. Those DLP policies are not theoretical paper statements. They are enforced by the platform's decision engine at design time and at runtime. When a maker tries to build across a boundary you declared invalid, the platform stops them. Finally, compliance. Power Platform inherits Microsoft's broader compliance stack. Certifications like ISO, SOC, GDPR alignment, HIPAA support, region-specific obligations. It integrates with Microsoft Purview for auditing, so admin, maker, and user actions around apps and flows can be logged and searched in the same compliance portal as your Exchange and SharePoint events. Dataverse auditing lets you see who changed which field, when, and from what to what. Power Automate and Power Apps events can be surfaced through Microsoft 365 audit logs. With managed environments and the newer Security Hub, you also get a security score, a qualitative view of whether you've actually turned on the controls that exist. From a platform perspective, this matters. Identity is centralized and strongly authenticated. Data at rest and in transit is encrypted with enterprise options for key management. Guardrails like DLP and tenant isolation exist and are enforced. Compliance hooks and audit logs are there. If you're looking for the easy story where Power Platform is insecure, you won't find it in the core architecture. Enterprise low-code platform security is not the weak link. The weak link is what you choose to do or not do with the control plane that sits on top of it. So if the foundation is this strong, the obvious question becomes, where do things actually break in production tenants? They don't break in Azure. They break when governance disappears, and where security breaks, when governance disappears. If the platform is this strong, why do real tenants still end up with data exfiltration, audit failures, and apps nobody can support? Because security almost never fails at the cryptography layer. It fails at the governance layer. There are 3 structural failure points that show up in almost every enterprise Power Platform review. The first is the open default environment. By design, every tenant gets a default environment. If you've done nothing, every licensed user is effectively an environment maker there. That means anyone can build apps and flows, connect to whatever your DLP allows, and share with anyone in the tenant. If you never repurpose that default environment, never constrained it to personal productivity, never put a tight DLP policy around it, never turned on monitoring, you've basically created a global sandbox directly attached to your production data. People don't do this maliciously. They just press create where the button appears. But from an architectural perspective, an ungoverned default environment is an entropy generator. It's constantly producing new assets that don't map to any operating model. The second failure point is free-for-all environment creation. If anyone or any broad admin group can create environments on demand, you get a different flavor of chaos. Project teams spin up a new environment just for this initiative. Consultants create environments for POCs and never clean them up. Regional teams create copies of production with slightly tweaked names. Each of those environments is a new control plane surface, its own DLP scope, its own security roles, its own connectors, its own Dataverse database. If you don't have a platform team curating those, you end up with dozens or hundreds of environments whose purpose, owner, and risk level are unclear. At that point, no amount of Entra ID or AES 256 saves you. You're running a fleet you don't understand. The third failure point is the absence of a coherent data loss prevention strategy. You technically have DLP policies. Someone created test DLP 1 during a pilot 2 years ago. Another admin copied it and tweaked a connector. A consultant added an environment-level policy for a specific project. Over time, you've accumulated a stack of overlapping, inconsistent policies whose intent no one can explain. In some environments, Gmail is blocked. In others, it's quietly allowed because nobody added the policy there. In dev, HTTP connectors are wide open. In prod, they're blocked, but nobody ever tested the migration path. The default environment sits under a tenant-wide policy that looked reasonable before Copilot started generating apps. This is where architectural erosion becomes visible. Every exception, bypass, and temporary override becomes security debt. I'll just add Outlook.com to business connectors for now. We'll remove it after the demo. We'll clone production into this uncopy environment so the vendor can test. We'll delete it later. We'll disable this DLP policy because it's blocking an important flow. We'll fix it next sprint. Those next sprints rarely arrive. The exceptions stay. New ones accumulate. Your control plane drifts further away from your governance intent. At small scale, you can still reason about it. At enterprise scale, thousands of makers, tens of thousands of apps and flows across dozens of environments. You're no longer in a deterministic security model. You're in probabilistic territory. You've moved from we know exactly what's allowed to we think this combination is probably safe. That's what I mean by conditional chaos. On paper, you're a zero-trust shop. You verify explicitly. You use least privilege. You assume breach. In practice, your conditional access rules, your DLP policies, your environment roles, and your special case environments have grown organically. Nobody has an end-to-end map of how a given identity on a given device in a given location interacting with a given app will actually be treated. At that point, blaming Power Platform security is convenient but inaccurate. Most of the risks you'll see at scale, data exfiltration through connectors, shadow IT flows over regulated data, apps with no clear owner, business-critical logic wired through a personal account, are governance failures masquerading as platform issues. Power Platform Shadow IT isn't people sneaking in a new SaaS product. It's people doing exactly what the platform allows in the absence of guardrails. And once Copilot and agentic AI enter that already weak governance model, the risk doesn't just increase linearly. It multiplies because now the platform can generate apps and flows faster than your existing manual controls can classify or review them. So to make this tangible, let's stop talking in abstractions. Let's walk through a set of real-world patterns. Manufacturing, financial services, healthcare, retail, and professional services. Different industries, different regulatory pressures, same underlying story. The platform was secure, governance disappeared in the control plane. Scenario 1, global manufacturing, ERP data leaks through connectors. Take a global manufacturing company, centralized ERP running in a secure data center. Regional finance teams scattered across plants in Europe, Asia, North America. Tight change control on the ERP itself. Audited, segregation of duties, all the classic controls. Then someone discovers Power Automate. A regional finance analyst is tired of downloading CSVs from ERP, cleaning them in Excel, and emailing them around for reconciliations. They open Power Automate from Outlook, see automate a business process, and start experimenting. The tenant already has a Power Platform DLP policy. It was created during a pilot. It marks SAP, SQL, SharePoint, and Exchange as business connectors. It leaves things like Dropbox, Gmail, and HTTP in the default bucket. Nobody revisited it after go live. In the default environment, with that default policy, our analyst builds something simple, a scheduled flow that connects to ERP via a premium connector, pulls yesterday's sales and inventory, writes the data to a SharePoint list, and then emails a summary to a distribution list. So far, still inside the boundary, still mostly fine. Then a plant manager says, I'd love to see this on my personal device. I don't want to VPN into anything. Someone suggests, just send it to my Gmail as well. I'll forward it where it needs to go. The analyst adds a second action to the flow. Send an email via the Outlook, connector to whatever external addresses are needed, attaching the CSV output. From their perspective, this is a harmless convenience. From a DLP perspective, something important just happened. ERP data that used to live only in a tightly controlled SAP landscape is now flowing through Power Automate into SharePoint, into Exchange, and out through a consumer email service. All because the original DLP policy never drew a hard boundary between enterprise systems and consumer services. Fast forward 6 months. The COE starter kit, if it exists, shows a connector inventory with both business and non-business connectors active in the default environment. There's a DLP policy definition called ERP Pilot that still has Outlook, classified as business. Nobody remembers why. The admin center has usage reports, but nobody's correlating them with data classification. An internal audit kicks off, not because of Power Platform, but because of a broader GDPR review. Pause here. This is the part most audits fail on. They follow the data. They find SAP tables with customer information, and they find a Power Automate flow that touches those tables. They see it pushing data into SharePoint lists with permissive access. They find email logs showing CSVs with customer IDs being sent to personal inboxes for convenience. At that moment, every control you built around your ERP is irrelevant. The effective boundary is now the weakest connector in the chain. When the auditors ask, where can this ERP data go? Your diagrams show firewalls, role-based access, and carefully controlled integrations. Power Automate doesn't appear anywhere on the slide. But in the tenant, the reality is different. The DLP policy never said data from ERP and Dataverse in this environment cannot be combined with consumer email or consumer storage. Nobody ran a DLP impact analysis when those connectors were moved into business for a one-off project. Nobody reviewed connector usage by data domain. This is not a hacker problem. This is a DLP design problem. If you cannot answer with evidence where can this data go, your Power Platform DLP policies have already failed, regardless of how strong your underlying ERP security is. Notice what didn't fail here. Entra ID still required authentication. Encryption still worked. The connectors did exactly what they were designed to do. The platform honored the policies it was given. The failure was architectural. You treated DLP as a checkbox instead of as an expression of data governance. You allowed business and non-business connectors to coexist in the same environment where regulated ERP data was being processed. You never revisited the policy when Power Platform moved from pilot to production reality. Multiply that pattern across payroll exports, HR data, supplier pricing, engineering drawings, and you get the real shadow IT story. Not rogue SaaS, but sanctioned automations quietly bypassing your original data flow assumptions. So the lesson from global manufacturing is simple but non-negotiable. If your DLP strategy doesn't start from data classification and answer where can this data go and where can it never go, you have already accepted data exfiltration as a probabilistic outcome. This was not a breach. This was a boundary failure. The platform was secure. Governance disappeared in the control plane. Scenario 2, financial services. Audit fails on ownership and shadow it. Now shift to a regulated financial services organization. They've been empowering the business with Power Apps and Power Automate for years. Internal comms, celebrated citizen development. Licensing is generous. Business units can request environments with a one-page form. On paper, it looks like a successful digital transformation. What they never built was an ownership model. There's a center of excellence, but it's mostly a reporting function. It runs the COE starter kit, sends out a quarterly dashboard, and hosts an occasional maker community call. It does not actually own a governance operating model. By year 3, the numbers look impressive. The COE dashboards show thousands of apps and flows. Adoption is up. Every major business line has critical automations sitting on Power Platform. Some are IT built, many are not. Nobody can tell at a glance which is which. Then a regulatory audit arrives. The scope isn't Power Platform. The scope is payment processing, customer onboarding, sanction screening, classic financial services topics. But because those processes now depend on low-code automation, Power Apps and Power Automate show up in the process maps. The auditors ask a simple question. Which of these automations are in scope and who is accountable for each of them? The enterprise scrambles. They open the COE inventory. They see, for example, 4,000 plus cloud flows across all environments, hundreds marked as runs frequently in production environments. A surprising number where the owner is a user account flagged as a lever in Entra ID. Many apps with descriptions like Onboarding V2 or Payments Helper with no business service mapping. They export the list to Excel. They start filtering by environment name. Prod payments maintain customer onboarding, risk KYC. That helps a little, but not enough. Environment naming was never enforced. Some critical flows still live in a generic shared prod environment created by a project years ago. Purview logs confirm usage. Flows tied to lever accounts are still running. Apps that look like prototypes are being opened hundreds of times a day. There is clear business dependency, but no clear owner in any system of record. The auditors come back to their original question. For each automation that touches in-scope processes, who is the accountable business owner and what is the lifecycle control? You don't have an answer. You have an Excel export, a QE dashboard, and a lot of tribal knowledge. From a governance perspective, 3 things went wrong here. First, there was no Power Platform solution ownership model. Nobody made no owner X with no app a rule. Nobody required that every production solution have a named business owner, a technical owner, a mapped business service or process, a documented lifecycle. When it was last reviewed, what happens if the owner leaves? Second, there was no lifecycle management. Flows were created as pilots, then quietly became production because they worked. Makers left the company, Their Entra ID accounts were disabled, but their apps and flows were reassigned to generic admin accounts without any business review. Dependency grew, but nothing in the control plane reflected that criticality. Third, the COE was reporting, not governing. It surfaced the existence of assets but didn't drive decisions. No one had a standing process like, every quarter we will identify orphaned apps and flows in production environments and either assign owners or decommission them. The COE had telemetry, not authority. So during the audit, phrases like shadow it start appearing in the notes. But this isn't classic shadow IT, rogue SaaS purchased on a credit card. These are sanctioned tools on a sanctioned platform running inside your tenant, built with your licenses, over your data, under your Entra ID. The only thing missing is ownership. From the auditor's standpoint, an orphaned solution that moves money, onboards customers, or touches KYC is not a hygiene issue. It's a control failure. There is no accountable person to question, no documented change history that anyone trusts, and no guarantee that the logic has ever been tested against current policy. This was not a shadow IT problem. This was a missing ownership problem. And it's important to see how subtle the path was. At no point did someone say, we choose to run regulated processes on unowned flows. What happened was the business needed automation. Power Platform made it easy to build. The COE celebrated adoption. Nobody hardwired ownership and lifecycle into the operating model. By the time audit arrives, it's too late to retrofit. You can clean up going forward, but you can't convincingly reconstruct years of ownership history for thousands of artifacts. So the lesson from financial services is this. If you cannot produce, on demand, a list of production apps and flows with named business owners and lifecycle states, you don't have a governance model. You have a usage report. This was not shadow it now. This was missing ownership. The platform was secure. Governance disappeared in the control plane. Or to put it more bluntly, if you already have a COE but it doesn't enforce ownership and lifecycle, you don't have governance. You have a meeting. Scenario 3, healthcare. PHI in the wrong environment. Now take a healthcare provider operating under HIPAA equivalent regulation. They adopted Power Platform aggressively during a crisis. Clinics needed triage apps, labs needed intake forms, care teams needed lightweight tracking for follow-ups. Traditional build cycles were too slow, so Power Apps and Power Automate filled the gap. It did one thing right at the start. They created multiple environments. There was clinic apps, back office, research, and a generic prod shared. They even created a PHI-restricted environment because someone at least recognized that protected health information should live somewhere special. On paper, that looks like an environment strategy. In reality, it was just a list of names. The lesson here should land early. Environment names are not classification. If you don't bind environments to concrete data rules, you've just created labels, not controls. Nobody ever mapped those environments to data classification. Nobody wrote down PHI is only allowed in these environments. Non-PHI must never be in them. Specific connectors are banned here. Every app here is automatically in regulatory scope. The names were suggestive, not authoritative. A clinic team needs a triage app. They work with a contractor who has built similar things before. The contractor is an experienced Power Apps maker, comfortable with Dataverse. They ask for an environment to build in. Someone in IT says use clinic apps. That's what the name suggests. In that environment, Dataverse is provisioned. The contractor creates tables for patients, encounters, symptoms, and notes. They configure a model-driven app for staff and a Canvas app for quick intake on tablets. It works. The clinics love it. So far, still relatively contained. Then a new use case emerges, tracking patients referred to specialists, including diagnoses, medications, and lab results. That dataset is clearly PHI, not just operational metadata. A security-conscious architect suggests we should put that in PHI restricted. That's why we created it. Under time pressure, the contractor copies the existing Dataverse tables and app configuration from clinic apps into PHI restricted. They export a solution, import it into the PHI environment, and then fix up the roles to match. Here is where the architectural failure happens. Instead of designing roles from first principles for PHI restricted, they copy the security roles from clinic apps. Those roles were designed for a broad set of clinic staff, reception, nurses, doctors, and some back-office coordinators. They granted table-level read access to patient and encounter records because in the non-PHI triage context, that was acceptable. In PHI restricted, that same set of roles now effectively grants large groups of staff access to diagnosis codes, medication histories, and lab values they should never see. From their perspective, nothing seems wrong. Users log in with the same accounts. The app looks similar. They can do their job. Performance is fine. Auditing, if enabled, shows expected activity. The only hint of a problem appears months later when an internal privacy team performs a routine check. They pull an environment inventory. They see PHI restricted. Good. They see tables with names that clearly contain PHI. expected. Then they look at the Dataverse security roles and their assignments. They find a generic clinic user role with read access to PHI tables. That role assigned to large security groups covering wide swaths of staff. No differentiation between care teams or specialties or minimum necessary access. No documentation linking roles to job functions. They compare that to the role model in the underlying EHR system, which is tightly segmented by specialty and location. The gap is obvious. If you remember one thing from this healthcare example, remember this. Copying a role model from a non-PHI environment into a PHI environment is not reuse. It's a compliance violation waiting to be discovered. Functionally, PHI in the Power Platform environment is far more broadly visible than PHI in the primary clinical system. Not because anyone overrode encryption or broke authentication, but because they copied a convenience-oriented role model from a non-PHI context into a PHI context without redesign. Auditors dig deeper. They ask for a field-level security matrix. It doesn't exist. Field-level security was never turned on. Social security numbers, addresses, diagnosis descriptions, all treated as regular columns. They ask for a record of who approved this access design for PHI restricted. There is no record. There was a project plan, some emails, and a deployment ticket that said promote to PHI restricted. Nobody with formal privacy accountability signed off on the Dataverse security configuration. From a regulatory standpoint, this is not an edge case. It's a systematic failure. Environment strategy without data classification is not neutral. It's a compliance trap. You created a PHI environment, but you never bound it to a stricter security model. You allowed roles to be copy-pasted from non-PHI spaces. You never mandated field-level security for sensitive attributes. You never defined which personas existed in that environment and how least privilege would be enforced. So you end up in the worst possible position. You can't honestly claim ignorance because the environment is literally called PHI restricted, but you also can't demonstrate that you applied a proportional security design. This was not an encryption problem. This was a role design problem. The platform was secure. Governance disappeared in the control plane. And again, the path was entirely understandable. Time pressure, reuse of existing patterns, lack of a platform team with authority over environment design, and a deeply human instinct to copy something that already works instead of designing from scratch. The lesson from healthcare is straightforward. If your environment strategy is based on team names instead of data classification, you haven't reduced risk. You've just hidden it behind friendly labels. Scenario 4. Retail, business-critical app dies with its creator. Now move into retail. A large retailer with thousands of stores has been modernizing store operations. Task management, shrink reporting, inventory exceptions, maintenance tickets, all the small workflows that used to live in binders and email threads are slowly moving on to Power Apps and Power Automate. One store manager is particularly good with technology. They start as a classic citizen developer. First, a simple checklist app, then a basic incident logging tool, then a more sophisticated solution that wires together inventory data, staffing, and maintenance. Over a couple of years, that side project quietly becomes business critical. Here's how it happens. The original app tracks store incidents, spills, breakages, equipment issues. Over time, it grows features, integration with a shared Excel file for tracking costs, a Power Automate flow that notifies maintenance when freezer temperatures cross a threshold, another flow that sends summaries to regional managers every Monday, a Canvas app embedded in Teams that staff use on handhelds. The app lives in what was originally a department environment called Ops Tools. Nobody ever reclassified it as production. Nobody updated the environment strategy when this solution became central to store operations. Ownership is informal. The creator is the store manager. They are the environment admin, the app owner, the person everyone pings when something looks odd. It is dimly aware of the solution, but happy to see the stores innovating. There is no RACI, there is no ticket queue, there is no documented support model. Then the creator leaves. Maybe they get promoted to a different business unit. Maybe they move to a competitor. Maybe they take a sabbatical. Their Entra ID account is disabled as part of the standard HR offboarding process. In Entra ID, that's the end of the story. In Power Platform, it's the start of a slow-motion incident. Initially, nothing obvious breaks. The app still opens because users have direct share permissions. Some flows keep running because ownership was quietly reassigned to a generic admin account when the user was deprovisioned. From the store's perspective, life goes on. But entropy is already in motion. A schema change happens in the underlying data source. A column is added to the Excel sheet, or a new field appears in Dataverse because someone extended the model for a related project. The app wasn't built with that change in mind. A formula breaks in one screen. Staff start seeing errors when they submit certain types of incidents. They open tickets with the central service desk. The service desk looks in their ITSM system. There is no CI record for this app. No support team. No documented owner. The ticket bounces between applications via store operations and infrastructure. Nobody can answer a simple question: who is responsible for fixing this Power App? In parallel, one of the flows that sends weekly summaries starts failing. The failure shows up in Power Automate as a run history full of red exclamation marks. The notification emails stop. Regional managers assume the stores are just having a quiet week. After a month, someone notices that incident volumes look suspiciously low. They escalate. It finally goes into the Power Platform admin center. They find the app. They can see usage patterns that are heavy in certain regions, daily usage across hundreds of users. They see that the current owner is a generic admin account with no human tied to it. They see related flows, some suspended due to errors, some still running. They ask the COE team, who built this and where is the documentation there? The COE team can tell them that the original creator's UPN was bound to the app. They can show when ownership was transferred to the admin account. They can export the dependency graph. What they can't do is tell them why the app was designed the way it was, what business rules it encodes, or what the acceptable behavior is. From the business perspective, this is a production outage. Store staff revert to manual reporting. Spreadsheets reappear. Incidents go unlogged. Maintenance is slower. There is no official severity 1 incident in your classic IT systems, but the impact is real. From a governance perspective, this is the inevitable outcome of one design choice. You allowed a business-critical app to exist in production without a clear ownership and lifecycle model. There was no rule that said, no owner is no app. There was no requirement that any app with certain usage or impact be onboarded into your standard support model. There was no lifecycle policy that said, if the owner is a leaver, the app must be reviewed or decommissioned. This was not a platform reliability problem. This was a lifecycle governance problem. The uncomfortable part is that the platform behaved exactly as designed. Power Apps didn't randomly delete anything. Power Automate didn't spontaneously corrupt your logic. The admin center even had enough telemetry to warn you if someone had been looking. Heavy usage tied to a small number of owners, flows failing, repeatedly orphaned assets. Governance chose not to act. So the lesson from retail is blunt. If an app is important enough that you'd open a severity 1 incident when it breaks, it is important enough to have a documented owner, a support model, and a life cycle. Pause on this because it's the only rule that consistently survives incidents. No owner equals no app. No owner equals no app is not optional. It is your only realistic business continuity policy for citizen-built solutions. This was not a platform reliability problem. The platform was secure. Governance disappeared in the control plane. Scenario 5. Professional services. Copilot quietly multiplies risk. Now let's look at a professional services firm. Legal, consulting, tax, pick your poison. The common pattern is the same: expensive humans, time and materials billing, and a lot of very sensitive documents. Leadership is under pressure to do something with AI. They see Microsoft Copilot everywhere. Slide decks promise productivity gains, so they make the predictable move. Turn on Copilot capabilities in Power Platform to increase efficiency for knowledge workers. There is just one problem. They do this before they can even govern human-built apps properly. In the tenant, there is already a mix of Power Apps and Power Automate flows, meta intake forms, conflict check automations, document review trackers, simple time entry helpers tied into billing. Ownership is patchy. Some live in IT-owned environments, others in team spaces, many in a generic apps prod environment created during an early pilot. The COE has inventory, but not much classification. DLP policies exist, but they were written with classic connectors in mind: SharePoint, Exchange, SQL, a handful of line of business APIs. When Copilot Studio and Copilot features in Power Apps and Power Automate light up, the makers don't get a new governance story. They just get a new button. Describe what you want to build. A senior associate types. Create an app that tracks matters with fields for client, jurisdiction, practice area, lead partner, and current status. Add a screen that lists open matters by deadline. Copilot scaffolds a Dataverse table, some screens, a couple of views. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to iterate on. They tweak it, wire in some flows for notifications, and publish. In a day, they've shipped what would have taken weeks to get through traditional IT. Repeat that pattern across dozens of teams. HR builds a feedback tracker. Tax builds a workflow for extension requests. Risk builds a conflicts review helper. All of them use Copilot to accelerate schema design, formulas, and expressions. Architecturally, something quiet and important changes. You no longer have a neat division between IT-built apps and business-built apps. You have a fast-growing set of AI-assisted assets whose intent is only partially visible in human minds. The people who built them didn't write every line. They accepted and tweaked suggestions. Now look at this from the governance side. The admin center inventory grows. You see new apps, new flows, new connections. Many of them were created via Copilot. But there is no mandatory tagging that says AI generated versus human authored. There is no required owner metadata beyond the basic maker identity. There is no prompt logging that says these were the natural language instructions that shaped this asset. The COE dashboards show adoption going up. There is internal excitement. Leaders see demos of Copilot surfacing key clauses from contracts stored in SharePoint or summarizing status from Dataverse tables. It looks like innovation. Then risk and compliance start asking questions. They pull a list of apps and flows that touch client data. They want to know which of these were built with Copilot, what prompts were used. Did anyone ask Copilot to summarize or transform client documents that contain privileged or regulated information? Where are those prompts and intermediate outputs stored? You don't have answers. Copilot usage logs exist at a platform level, but you never wired them into your governance story. There is no standard that says every AI-assisted asset must be registered with the platform team, tagged with its risk level, and linked to a business owner. There is no AI-specific DLP model that says Copilot cannot read from these repositories or write to those. So you end up with the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, you have all the classic low-code risks, unclear ownership, weak environment strategy, inconsistent DLP. On the other hand, you've just attached an acceleration engine to that weak governance model. Copilot is not misbehaving. It's doing exactly what it was asked to do. Generate a flow that copies documents from this library to that one. Suggest columns based on this description of a client matter system. Write an expression to filter records where status is active and deadline is in the next 14 days. The trouble is that nobody is systematically reviewing what it produced, where it connected, or how it changed the shape of data movement. An internal investigation eventually finds a Copilot-generated flow that listens to a SharePoint library where draft contracts are stored, sends summaries of those contracts to a shared mailbox for a review group, logs those summaries in a Dataverse table called contract summaries. The review mailbox is fine. The Dataverse table lives in an environment with Slack DLP rules and broad membership. Junior staff who should never see the substance of certain deals can now browse summaries. Again, nothing here breached the core security model. Entra ID authenticated everyone. SharePoint permissions were respected. Dataverse dutifully stored what it was told. DLP never complained because from its perspective, everything stayed inside business connectors. This was not an AI safety failure. This was a governance failure that Copilot multiplied. And that's the pattern to pay attention to. If you cannot govern human-built apps and flows today, if you don't have environment strategy, DLP guardrails, ownership, lifecycle, and metrics, you are not ready to govern AI-generated ones. Copilot and agentic AI are accelerants for whatever governance posture you already have, good or bad. Most Copilot failures will not look like AI failures. They will look like ordinary governance failures, just faster. So the lesson from professional services is simple and uncomfortable. If your low-code governance framework cannot handle humans, it will not handle agents. Governance is not a PDF defining a real operating model. By this point, the pattern should be obvious. Manufacturing leaked data because DLP was a one-time configuration, not a living system. Financial services failed audit because ownership was a slide, not a practice. Healthcare exposed PHI because environment names pretended to be classification. Retail broke because lifecycle was implicit, not enforced. Professional services multiplied risk because Copilot landed on top of all of that. All of those are symptoms of the same root cause. You don't have a governance operating model. You have governance documents. Architecturally, governance has to behave like an operating system, not a PDF. An operating system does three things. It defines decision rights, it implements feedback loops, it has enforcement mechanisms. Decision rights answer, who decides? At every key boundary, who decides which environments are allowed to exist? Who decides what DLP patterns are acceptable for finance versus HR versus R&D? Who decides when something is production and must meet stricter criteria? Who decides which connectors are allowed into a regulated environment? If the answer to all of those is a committee or it depends, you don't have decision rights. You have diffusion of responsibility. Feedback loops answer, how do we know reality still matches intent? That means you're not just setting policies once, you're measuring adherence. You have metrics for orphaned apps and flows. You watch DLP violations over time. You track environment growth relative to actual usage. You look at the ratio of citizen-built assets to incidents. So when thresholds are crossed, something happens. Enforcement mechanisms answer what actually changes when the system drifts. Not in theory, in practice. If orphaned flows exceed 2%, who triggers remediation? If a non-approved connector appears in a production environment, who has the authority to block it and force a review? If an app crosses a usage threshold that makes it business critical, who can insist it be onboarded into ALM and support? If you can't answer those questions with concrete names and actions, you don't have an operating model. You have governance theater. This is where a lot of organizations misunderstand the role of a Power Platform Center of Excellence. The QE Starter Kit is a set of tools. It is not by itself an operating model. You can have beautiful dashboards, usage reports, and maker statistics, and still have no real control. If you already have a COE, but it doesn't look like an operating system with decision rights, feedback loops, and enforcement, you don't have a governance model. You have a meeting. So what does a real Power Platform governance operating model look like? First, it is platform team-led. You stand up a platform team whose mandate is clear. own standards and guardrails, not every app. They're not a dev factory. They don't become a bottleneck for every citizen-built form. Their job is to design and operate the control plane. Environments, DLP, identity patterns, ALM pipelines, monitoring, and metrics. Second, it organizes policy along 3 axes. Scale, how many makers and assets are we talking about? Sensitivity, what class of data is involved? Public, internal, confidential, regulated. Criticality, what is the impact if this app or flow fails? Annoyance, local disruption, enterprise-wide outage, regulatory breach. Every solution lives somewhere on those 3 axes. A personal productivity flow in the default environment is low sensitivity, low criticality, small scale. A payments approval app in finance prod is high sensitivity, high criticality, and potentially large scale. Your operating model doesn't treat those the same. It defines policy tiers. Low tier, permissive environments with strict DLP around external connectors, limited sharing, lightweight ownership. Medium tier, departmental solutions with enforced ALM, stronger DLP, clear Reiki. High tier, enterprise or regulated solutions with dedicated environments, locked down connectors, mandatory lifecycle processes, and formal sign-off. Third, the operating model runs every day. It has routines, day-to-day monitoring of flows failing in production, weekly reviews of new production-tagged apps crossing usage thresholds, monthly checks on orphaned assets and DLP violations, quarterly reviews with security and compliance on regulated environments and AI agents. The point is simple. Governance is not what's written down. Governance is what runs. Once you think of it as an operating system, you can start to design it intentionally with a platform team charter, a clear RACI, an environment strategy that maps to data classification, and a time-bound plan, day 30, day 90, to get from chaos to something you can defend in front of its CISO. Platform team-led operating model, charter, RACI, environments, day 30, 90. So let's make this concrete. If governance is an operating system, the platform team is the kernel. Everything else is user land. The platform team charter is simple and non-negotiable. They own the platform, not every app. They own standards, patterns, and guardrails. They do not become a ticket queue for please build my form. Architecturally, their responsibilities fall into 4 buckets. First, control plane design. They define the environment strategy, which environments exist, what they're called, which security groups map to each one, what data classifications are allowed where, which DLP policies apply, which regions are used. They own the baseline conditional access patterns for Power Platform surfaces. They decide what managed environment means in your tenant. Second, patterns and ALM. They provide reference architectures. If you're building a departmental approval app, here's the template, here's the pipeline, here's how you move from dev to test to prod. They standardize on a small set of ALM patterns, native pipelines, Azure DevOps, or GitHub, and make those the default paths to production. They don't handcraft every solution, but they define how solutions should behave. Third, monitoring and metrics. They own the dashboards. COE inventory, DLP impact analysis, environment health, flow failure rates, orphaned asset percentages, adoption versus incident ratios. They set thresholds and wire alerts. They are the first ones to see when governance starts to drift. Fourth, enablement and escalation. They run the maker onboarding experience, the documentation of guardrails, the internal Power Platform hub. They provide guidance sessions, pattern reviews for higher risk solutions, and they act as the escalation point when something crosses a risk threshold and needs to be pulled into a stricter regime. To make that work, you need a clear RACI. Business owns data and outcomes. The platform team owns the platform and patterns. Security and compliance own control objectives. IT operations own support for infrastructure and core services. So, for a given app, business is responsible for defining what it does and why it matters. Business is accountable for the risk of using it. Platform team is consulted on architecture, environment, and DLP fit. Security and compliance are consulted on regulated scenarios. ITOps is informed about support impact and dependencies. If your current model makes IT accountable for every low-code asset, you've already lost. You will either block everything or silently accept risk you don't own. Now, environments. You need a minimum viable environment tiering that aligns to data sensitivity and criticality, not org chart. At the bottom, a lockdown default environment scope to personal productivity, tight DLP, no premium connectors, no business critical data. Think, tell me when my manager emails me, not run payroll. Then, non-regulated dev test prod tiers for departmental and enterprise apps. Names that actually mean something. Dept dev, dept test, dept prod, enterprise prod. Each with its own DLP policy, security groups, and ALM pipelines. Production is invitation only. You don't accidentally land there. Alongside that, restricted or regulated environments. Finance reg, PHI restricted, client sensitive. These are mapped explicitly to data classifications. Only certain connectors are allowed. Only certain roles exist. Every asset there is, by definition, in scope for audit. Environment creation is not a free-for-all. It's a controlled operation run by the platform team, ideally automated with requests and approvals that capture purpose, owner, and expected data class. That's the steady state. How do you get there from where you are? You use a day 30, day 90 plan. Day is the freeze. You don't fix everything, you stop it getting worse. You freeze ad hoc environment creation and switch it to admin only. You define, at least roughly, which existing environments are prod, which are dev test, and which are unknown. You deploy a baseline tenant-wide DLP policy that blocks the worst consumer connectors in all but the default environment. You turn on audit logging where it's off. You identify the top-end production-looking environments by usage. The goal for day is simple: reduce the rate of new entropy. Day 30 is structure. You stand up or formalize the platform team. You publish a first-pass environment strategy and map existing environments into it. You define and socialize the RICE and the rule no owner x no app in prod. You deploy at least one standard ALM pattern and apply it to net new high criticality solutions. You get the COE or equivalent telemetry running, if it isn't already. You don't have all the answers by day 30, but you've drawn the map. Day 90 is enforcement. You start enforcing lifecycle management for production environments. Review orphaned assets, decommission or reassign. You apply DLP policies per environment tier instead of one giant inconsistent blob. You publish metrics, orphaned flow percentage, DLP violations, environment growth. You wire alerts to real people. You also make your first firm decision on AI governance. Which environments can use Copilot? What tagging, logging, and review are mandatory for AI-assisted assets? How prompts are treated from a privacy perspective. By day 90, you're not done, but you've moved from accidental behavior to an operating model you can stand in front of a CISO and defend. And the rule that underpins all of it stays simple. If the platform matters enough to worry about its security, it matters enough to have a platform team running a real operating model. Metrics that matter, turning governance into a measurable system. At this point, there's a predictable objection. Okay, platform team, environments, DLP, ownership, day 30-90. How do we know if any of this is actually working? If you can't answer that with numbers, you're not running governance. You're running theater. Governance without metrics is just well-phrased intent. So what does it mean to treat Power Platform governance as a measurable system? If you remember one thing from this section, make it this. Metrics only matter if they drive action. It starts with one principle. You cannot steer what you do not measure, and you should not measure what you're not prepared to act on. So the first job of the platform team is not to build prettier dashboards. It's to define a small, brutal set of metrics that connect directly to control. Think of three categories: hygiene, risk, scale. Hygiene metrics tell you whether the basics are under control. The most important one is orphaned assets. Apps and flows in production environments with no valid business owner. You measure it as a percentage of total production assets, and you set a hard threshold. For example, if more than 2% of production flows or apps are orphaned, remediation is mandatory. Mandatory means three things actually happen. Platform team initiates remediation. They generate the list, open tickets, and drive the process. Business owner resolves. They either accept ownership, nominate a new owner, or approve decommissioning. Security validates. They confirm that anything decommissioned or reassigned doesn't leave residual access or data behind. That chain matters. Metrics without a clear who moves first, who closes, who checks, degrade into noise. The second hygiene metric is DLP violations. How many flows or apps attempt to use blocked connector combinations, and how quickly are those violations resolved? You don't just count violations, you put an SLA on them. For example, critical DLP violations in production. Anything involving regulated data or high-risk connectors must be triaged within 4 hours and either remediated or formally accepted within 24. Again, with ownership, platform team detects and classifies. Business owner decides whether the attempted pattern is legitimate. Security approves or rejects the pattern and updates policy if needed. Now, risk metrics. Here you care less about raw counts and more about ratios and trends. One useful metric is adoption versus incident ratio. For a given time period, how many net new production apps and flows went live and how many governance incidents occurred. Incidents meaning unauthorized data movement, access escalation, audit findings tied to Power Platform, or material outages from low-code assets. If your ratio is, say, 200 new production solutions and 1 minor incident per quarter, that's one story. If it's 50 solutions and 5 significant incidents, that's another. You're measuring not just how much you build, but how safely you're operating at that speed. Another risk metric is environment growth rate. How many environments do you have by tier, personal, departmental, enterprise, regulated, and how fast is that number changing? You might set a guardrail like net growth in production and regulated environments should not exceed 10% per quarter without review. Above that, the platform team and security sit down and ask, are we seeing environment proliferation as a proxy for missing patterns? Again, the metric is only useful if it triggers action. A growth spike might mean you need new standardized environment types, or that a particular business unit is treating environments as disposable sandboxes. Finally, scale metrics. You want to understand where citizen development is actually happening and whether it's distributed in a sane way. The COE dashboards can show you makers by business unit, asset counts by environment, and usage by app. You can convert that into something actionable: percentage of business units with at least one active maker, top 10 environments by usage and their owner quality, distribution of makers versus apps. Do you have a healthy maker community or a handful of heroes carrying everything? You combine those with your hygiene and risk metrics to decide where to invest enablement versus where to tighten controls. All of this is easily built with existing tools. The COE Starter Kit already collects most of the raw data. You can build Power BI reports that show inventory by environment, risk heat maps across sensitivity, owner quality, and usage, and trend lines over time. The trick is restraint. You do not need 40 metrics. You need a short list that an executive can understand on one slide and that your platform team can drive every week. For example, a minimal governance scorecard might be orphaned production assets, 1-2%, target 2%. Critical DLP violations resolved within 24 hours, 96%, target 100%. Net production regulated environment growth, 7%, target inclusion 10%. Adoption versus incident ratio, 150.1, target 101. Business units with active makers, 80%, target 70%. Each of those has a named owner and a defined next step when it drifts. When the orphaned percentage crosses 2%, platform opens remediation, business resolves, security validates. When DLP SLA drops, platform reviews the patterns, business justifies or retires, security tightens or adjusts policy. When environment growth spikes, platform freezes new creation in that tier until they understand the driver. That's what it means to turn governance into a measurable system. You're no longer arguing about whether you feel in control of Power Platform. You can point to a small set of numbers that track hygiene, risk, and scale, and to the routines that move those numbers in the right direction. And once you have that, you can finally have a sane conversation about zero trust in low code, because you're no longer guessing how the system behaves. You're measuring how it drifts. Zero trust meets low code, designing for conditional chaos. Zero trust gets thrown around so much it's almost background noise. Verify explicitly. Use least privilege. Assume breach. Pause here. This is where most zero trust slideware falls apart when it hits a low-code platform. The problem is that most zero trust conversations are about network edges and classic applications, not about a distributed, citizen-driven, low-code platform that can change shape every day. Power Platform is exactly that, a distributed decision engine that keeps evolving, which means if you don't design for zero trust here, you don't have it anywhere. So let's translate those three principles into the reality of apps, flows, environments, and connectors, and into the conditional chaos we talked about earlier. Start with verify explicitly. In the Power Platform world, that means two things: Entra conditional access and environment routing. You're not just deciding whether a user can sign in, you're deciding from where, on what, into which environment, and with what blast radius. So you establish clear patterns. Personal productivity lives in the default or personal dev environments, behind stricter DLP and with no access to regulated data. Departmental and enterprise apps live in named dev, test, prod environments, each backed by Entra security groups. Regulated workloads live only in restricted environments where access requires compliant devices, strong MFA, and maybe even network location controls. Environment routing and groups turn that into a deterministic pattern instead of an honor system. When a maker shows up, they don't land in the global sandbox. They land where their persona says they belong. Then use least privilege. In low code, least privilege is less about individual tables and more about patterns. You avoid maker as owner of everything designs, where the same human account owns the Dataverse environment, the apps, the flows, the custom connectors, and the Azure bits. You push ownership to service principals and managed identities where appropriate. You design Dataverse roles per persona instead of everyone gets basic user plus a few random grants. You also implement least privilege at the connector level. That means standard DLP sets like a core business set, Dataverse, SharePoint, Exchange, first-party line of business APIs. A collaboration set, Teams, Planner, certain external SaaS apps that have been risk assessed. A high-risk set, consumer email, personal storage, generic HTTP. You don't let a single app or flow span all three sets. If a solution truly needs to bridge them, it becomes an exception with explicit review, not a default. Now the uncomfortable one, assume breach. Assume a connector is compromised. Assume a maker account is phished. Assume a flow is misconfigured. What happens? In a zero trust-aware Power Platform design, DLP is not just a compliance box, it's your containment boundary. If a compromised maker account can only build in a departmental dev environment with no access to finance or PHI connectors, your blast radius is small. If the only place that talks to external SaaS is a dedicated integration environment with tightly scoped service principles, you've limited exfiltration paths. Audit logging and monitoring become your forensic backbone. You make sure every regulated environment has Dataverse auditing turned on for key tables and fields. You route Power Apps and Power Automate events into Purview or your CM. You use the COE telemetry not just for adoption metrics, but for anomaly detection, sudden spikes in connector usage, flows calling unusual endpoints, new environments with strange naming. And here's where conditional chaos comes back. Zero trust collapses if your patterns are opaque, bespoke, and constantly changing. Too many one-off conditional access rules, too many custom security roles, too many special environments, and you've built a system no human can reason about. So the real zero trust move in low-code is simplification. Fewer, clearer environment types, fewer standardized DLP sets, fewer well-defined role bundles and maker personas. You trade some flexibility for predictability. That might mean you say no to yet another special environment and instead refine an existing pattern. It might mean you collapse a sprawl of subtly different roles into 3 or 4 well-designed ones. It might mean you route all regulated workloads through a small number of heavily instrumented managed environments instead of sprinkling sensitivity everywhere. This is design philosophy, not configuration trivia. You're not trying to memorize every toggle in the admin center. You're trying to enforce a small number of architectural truths. Identities are verified and segmented by persona. Data paths are controlled by environment and DLP. Blast radius is limited by design, not by luck. Behavior is observable enough that when, not if, something odd happens, you can see it and respond. Once you understand that, adding Copilot and AI into the mix stops being magic and starts being just another category of identity and data flow you have to constrain. And that's the point you need to reach before you start treating AI as just more productivity on top of conditional chaos. Copilot, AI, and the next wave of governance pressure. Everything we've talked about so far was already true before AI showed up in Power Platform. Copilot doesn't change the laws of this system. It just removes the friction that was slowing those laws down. So you have to start with a simple, slightly brutal assumption. Whatever your governance posture is today, Copilot and agentic AI will accelerate it. If your control plane is clear, measured, and enforced, Copilot accelerates value. If your control plane is opaque, ad hoc, and full of entropy generators, Copilot accelerates failure. Architecturally, Copilot adds 3 new pressures. First, asset creation speed. Makers no longer have to understand every nuance of Power FX or Dataverse schema design. They can say, build me a case management app with these fields, and Copilot scaffolds something workable. They can say, generate a flow that notifies me when X happens, and the platform fills in the steps. That means the rate at which new apps and flows appear in your tenant increases even if the number of human makers doesn't. The traditional signals you relied on, who's in the maker community, who's requesting environments, become lagging indicators. Second, opaque intent. With human-built solutions, however messy, you can at least ask the maker what they intended. With AI-assisted solutions, the intent is split across a human prompt and an AI model's interpretation. If you don't log prompts, if you don't tag AI-generated assets, if you don't capture which copilots were used where, you lose the ability to reason about why a given app or flow exists and what it was meant to do. Third, blended authorship. In most enterprises, you will not have pure AI solutions or pure human solutions. You will have hybrids. A human starts something, Copilot suggests formulas, the human tweaks them, another Copilot refactors a flow later. Over time, the boundary between human and AI authorship blurs. That's why treating AI as a novelty feature is dangerous. Governance has to treat AI as a new category of identity and behavior in the system. So what does a sane Copilot governance stance look like? First, default restrict, don't default allow. Copilot capabilities in Power Apps, Power Automate, and Copilot Studio should be enabled first in a small set of well-understood environments, ideally non-regulated dev test tiers with good telemetry. You do not start by sprinkling AI across every environment where you already struggle to see what's happening. Second, mandatory tagging and logging. Every AI-assisted asset needs to declare itself. That can be as simple as a solution-level flag or a naming convention that's enforced by the platform team, but it must exist. You should be able to answer from the admin center or your COE dashboards which apps, flows, and agents were created or significantly modified with Copilot. In which environments do they live? Who is the accountable business owner for each? On top of that, prompt logging becomes part of your forensic toolkit. No, you don't need to hoard every prompt forever, but for regulated workloads, you do need an audit trail that shows what kinds of instructions were given to AI when building or operating a solution. That's not about spying on makers, it's about being able to explain behavior after the fact. Third, AI-specific DLP and connector rules. Copilot is just another client of your data, but it's a client that can connect things humans wouldn't think to connect. You need to be explicit about where AI can read from and where it can write to. For example, Copilot can read from internal knowledge bases, approved SharePoint sites, and Dataverse tables tagged as internal. Copilot cannot read directly from PHI or high-sensitivity financial data without going through a controlled agent in a restricted environment. Copilot cannot write to external mailboxes, consumer storage, or public-facing lists without a human-in-the-loop review. Those aren't product checkboxes. They're DLP patterns and environment choices. Finally, treat AI agents as non-human identities. From an Entra and Power Platform perspective, an agent is just another principal making decisions and calling APIs. So you give it the same rigor you would a service principal: least privilege access, clear scoping to specific environments and data classes, auditable activity trails, explicit lifecycle, how it's created, reviewed, retired. If you're not doing that, you're effectively giving root access to an opaque piece of logic that can act faster than any human and hide inside normal traffic. And keep this sentence in mind when the AI hype gets loud. Most Copilot failures will not look like AI failures. They will look like ordinary governance failures, or just faster. The wrong environment, the wrong connectors, no owner, no lifecycle, no metrics. Copilot just gets you to the failure state in days instead of months. So if your low-code governance framework cannot handle humans, it will not handle agents. Fix the framework first, then let AI amplify something you're willing to scale. The blunt answer and the real risk. So here's the blunt answer. Yes, Microsoft Power Platform is secure enough for serious enterprise use. The real risk lives in your governance, not in the platform. Power Platform doesn't create risk. It reveals whether your enterprise is governable at speed. If you want that answer to be yes, treat Power Platform as a product with a platform team, implement a 90-day governance plan, wire in metrics, and stop enabling Copilot in production without clear environments, DLP, ownership, and review.